Hi listeners, Dave here. How God Works will be back with an all-new season starting October 5th. Until then, we'll be sharing some of our favorite episodes from the archives. And for me personally, this is one of them. Data show that happiness tends to drop in midlife, but it doesn't have to, if we make some changes in our thoughts, values, and behaviors. What changes? Well, here's where advice from Arthur Brooks and Swami Tyagananda come in. As it turns out, faith traditions have a pretty good sense of how we should walk the path of life if we want to flourish. A sense that science is now backing up. And speaking as a now 57-year-old guy, I have to say that not a week goes by that I don't think about this episode and try to put some of its advice into practice. And every time I have over the past 3 years, I'm grateful for it. So whether you're facing midlife yourself or know someone who is, there's wisdom in here to use and share. I hope you enjoy it. My birthday was last month. I turned 54. And you know what I got for a present? An invitation to join AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. Retirement? I've got a few good years left to go, I hope. But this did get me thinking. Am I already starting my professional decline? I can't work all night writing like I used to, and no matter how hard I try, my younger colleagues are publishing way more papers and articles. And even though I'm physically in pretty good health, I've been feeling like I'm losing my edge over the past few years. Don't worry, you're not going to see me on Instagram in a shiny new sports car or anything like that. But this whole midlife thing, it's an adjustment. And to be honest, not really a happy one. And here, I'm not alone. For many people, midlife brings on feelings of frustration and regret. Data shows that happiness generally hits rock bottom around 50, exactly when antidepressant use peaks. But according to researcher Arthur Brooks, this so-called midlife slump doesn't actually have to be dreaded as a crisis. It can be celebrated as an evolution, if you do it right.
The data suggests that for most people there is a change, but it's not a crisis.
On this episode, we'll talk to Harvard professor and author Arthur Brooks about the shifts that happen in our body and mind in midlife, and what we could all do better to find strength and happiness in this life stage.
Change is the most normal thing, and change is something we ultimately need to embrace. So we need to go against our instinct.
And we'll speak with Swami Tyagananda, Harvard and MIT's Hindu chaplain, about how spirituality, and Hinduism in particular, have helped improve the transition to midlife for millennia.
The body-mind are both limited. And so the more I cling to my limited identity, I cannot express myself fully.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Arthur Brooks, like me, is a middle-aged man, but he certainly shows no signs of any midlife slump. In addition to being a columnist for The Atlantic and hosting their podcast, How to Build a Happy Life, Arthur has a distinguished career as a social scientist. And while he's studied many problems over the years, the one he's most focused on now is the one midlife brings, the so-called midlife crisis, or at least the midlife doldrums.
If you go back to the 1950s, the idea of the midlife crisis was brand new. Psychologists were talking about it for the first time. And then it really took on a life of its own in the popular zeitgeist. But the whole idea was that there was something that was going on psychologically, maybe even physiologically with people. And since then, the science has progressed an awful lot to give us a more nuanced perspective on what's happening. Now, to begin with, most people don't have a crisis. Most people, they see a change in their interests and their tastes and their abilities, but most people don't freak out and get a red sports car and divorce their spouse. Now, the later research also suggests that there's something going on in the structure of our brains, actually, that's taking us from one period and what we're really good at and what we're really interested in into another period and what we're good at and what we're interested in. This research goes to the so-called two intelligences theory that was really coined by Raymond Cattell, a British social psychologist. And he was doing this work in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And what he talked about was this natural tendency to be really good at hard work and concentration and innovation and processing speed, that we get better and better at through our 20s and 30s. It's what makes us successful early on in our careers, but that naturally declines starting in our late 30s generally, all the way through our 40s. And even if you're really good at your job and nobody sees that you're not in your groove anymore, you start getting bored with what you're doing when you're not as good at what you did. It's like, it's just not as fun. And when things are not as fun, then that feels like a funk. And that's what people have traditionally thought of. And that's called the fluid intelligence curve. And it goes up through your 20s and 30s, and it comes down through your 40s and especially your 50s. There's a second curve behind it called the crystallized intelligence curve. Now, that's not processing speed and the ability to work relentless hours. That's the ability, it's sort of your wisdom curve. Think of it as your Dalai Lama curve, where you get better and better at teaching, sharing ideas, synthesizing knowledge, knowing a lot, knowing what it means. So the first curve is your ability to answer sort of anybody's questions through hard work. The second is knowing which questions are worth answering. And that increases through your 40s and 50s. And that can stay high in your 60s and 70s and all the way to the end of life. So that time between the curves, that's this midlife insecurity. This is this period of what psychologists call liminality, where you need to kind of jump between these curves. Some people can do it and some people never do.
I remember reading, you wrote an article on this for The Atlantic a few years back about how you get into that midlife funk when you're at the peak of your career and suddenly it's harder and harder to stay on top. And I thought at that moment you were speaking to me because I'm in my early 50s. And, I'm a lab psychologist and I was always on the cutting edge. I was finding stuff nobody ever found before. And then it got hard. I had my kids. I got tired. I wasn't on the cutting edge. And so I really took your advice to heart, but I have to say, I'm a little hesitant about this. My raise next year depends on how many papers I get out and how many talks I get to give. So what evidence is there that if I do this, that 10 years from now, I'm going to be happier and not feel like a washed up has-been? Or if I do, that'll be okay and I'll feel okay about it.
Well, you won't be a washed-up has-been if you really get on your crystallized intelligence curve and exploit what you're truly good at. Now, I can't tell you that the university, that your employer is going to reward it in the same way. But there is a way that you can actually work the system to your advantage. If I look back at the papers that I was writing as a social scientist in my early 30s, I was using genetic algorithms to model public finance regimes. And I literally don't even understand the math that I was writing then. Today, I'm a professor of practice, which means that my job as a kind of a pracademic is to write for a broad audience. So I'm looking at the research literature and I'm talking about what it all means together and how people can use it in their lives. And so I've gone from a research social scientist writing very esoteric papers for 14 or 15 readers around the world to having somewhere between 2 and 500,000 readers a week with my weekly column in The Atlantic, which is for me perfect because fluid intelligence rewards the former and crystallized intelligence rewards the latter. It's kind of like when you have a lot of crystallized intelligence, you have the New York Public Library inside your brain. Now, it takes a long time to access the information. You've got this little research librarian that has to kind of run off and kind of gets distracted and stops for coffee and talks to a couple of friends. Sooner or later, he's going to come back with the volumes that you need to tell a very compelling story. So the fact that you're doing this podcast is perfect because you're a teacher. I mean, you're naturally a teacher. And no doubt, Dave, you found that your teaching has gotten better as you've gotten older because that's crystallized intelligence. Whereas actually doing the cutting edge research is harder. So going to the synthesized research, actually explaining the big ideas to the masses, that's the natural thing that people like you and I are best suited to do in our 50s.
Arthur's point here applies to everyone, not just professors. It boils down to stepping off the fast track and sharing what you have that younger folks don't, the wisdom and perspective that age brings. Whatever your career or life path, you have insights to offer to those who come after you.
My view is that people who are really high in crystallized intelligence, these people should be highly valued for running teams of people, to be teaching and explaining ideas that are very, very complex.
And this doesn't only apply to the middle-aged workforce. As far as Arthur's concerned, the age when most people are retiring, or at least professionally downshifting, is exactly the time that their insights could and should be leveraged in the workplace by their younger peers.
I think that every company in America should have at least one person over 70 in the C-suite, product teams, and every marketing team, because they've made every mistake in the books and can explain these things, and companies would just make fewer errors.
This all makes sense, but that doesn't mean it's easy to do.
Change is the most fundamental, common, inevitable thing in everybody's life, but it is also something that we're naturally going to resist because you tend to focus on the bad parts of change. That's how you stay alive. A twig snaps behind you, and your first instinct is to run. That's because fear accompanies change. But fear is not always the right cognition because change is the most normal thing, and change is something we ultimately need to embrace. So we need to go against our instincts.
Religions have ways of helping us deal with changes in life. But when it comes to pivot points, Hinduism might offer one of the best maps. It describes a system of life stages, or ashramas, that originated thousands of years ago but still have resonance today.
The 4 stages are connected with the 4 parts in the Hindu scripture, the Vedas.
That's Swami Tyagananda. He's the Hindu chaplain at Harvard and MIT, and he also leads Boston's Vedanta Society, a center that offers Hindu services and scripture classes to the community.
So the first stage is the student stage. It's called a Brahmacharya Ashrama. The second stage is the Garhastya Ashrama, the family life stage. The third stage is called Vanaprastha Ashrama, literally the stage of going to the forest, what today we might call the retirement stage. And the fourth stage is called the Sannyasa Ashrama, which is literally would be the stage of being a hermit or renouncing.
Traditionally, that means from childhood to about 25, people should be focused on learning the skills that will help them prosper in life. In other words, the student stage. From 25 until 50 or so, it's the householder stage. You're focused on worldly needs and pleasures, building a career, taking care of your family, enjoying what prosperity has to offer. But there's a quote from an ancient Hindu text called the Law of Manu that says, "When your skin begins to wrinkle and your hair turn gray, it's time for the stage of Vanaprastha, retirement, or the forest dweller." It's here, usually starting around 50 into your 70s, that you turn your desires away from climbing the ladder of success and begin to focus on more spiritual development and the sharing of wisdom. You're devoting your energies to helping others learn and grow, while you yourself focus on the more important aspects of life. Finally, it's the ascetic stage, the stage when you're literally preparing yourself for death, and in Hinduism, hopefully, a more auspicious reincarnation. These 4 stages aren't just labels. Moving through them in the right way, according to Hindu tradition, is a process of freedom and purification, and it's in that period from midlife through retirement that the transition to Vanaprastha should happen.
These 4 stages are a way of loosening the hold that my body and mind have upon me, freeing myself from that. So sometimes in the Hindu traditions, the body and the mind are compared to a prison house. So we are born in a prison. And as long as we are trapped inside the body and mind, we are not free. The goal of life is to see the reality as it is. Somehow that our present perception is clouded. We are not able to see things as they are. And the reason we are not able to see things as they are is that in religious language, they say impurity in the heart. What would mean psychologically is not enough clarity in my perception. When I am pure, nothing impinges upon my consciousness. I feel free in every way. The one way to purifying myself is to go through life in some prescribed manner.
Whether you see it as purifying your essence, or, as Swami said, clarifying your mental perceptions, The path laid out in the ashramas is meant to be a user manual of sorts, one for ourselves. It reminds us to make changes in our outlooks and lives that will help us find joy and serenity as we age. Arthur Brooks interprets the Vanaprastha stage in a slightly different way.
Vanaprastha is really thought of in ancient Hindu tradition as the second adolescence.
It's not so much a winding down as a point of reorienting. He says the Hindu sages have long taught that this is a time of spiritual development, if you can give yourself the space and time to do so.
Vanaprastha is where you recognize that you are changing and you need to step back. In other words, if you keep trying to stay on your fluid intelligence curve, you're going to ride it all the way down to the basement and be bummed out. That's effectively what that's about. Don't literally retire to the forest unless you want to. That retiring to the forest means stepping back from your ordinary responsibilities, unchaining yourself from the fluid intelligence curve of work, earn, achieve, success, stopping a success addict, and start considering the higher order issues. Where do you want to be for the fourth stage, which is going to come in 20 or 25 years, called sannyasa? You need to go into your teaching part of your life. You need to have students. You need to be contemplative. You need to be sharing. And so all of it is consistent. Vanaprastha is consistent with the crystallized intelligence curve.
Remember, this is the one Arthur calls your Dalai Lama curve, the one where you're synthesizing knowledge.
And the good news is if you take this crystallized intelligence and you work it into your career and into your life, it's way better than the fluid intelligence curve. It's correlated with greater happiness than your fluid intelligence curve and greater sense of personal fulfillment and success. The problem is a lot of people get stuck. I've asked my Hindu teachers, I've said, what about this person or that person that seems just so depressed about their declining abilities? They don't say, well, they're stuck in fluid intelligence. They say they're stuck in grihastha. They're stuck in the second quarter.
Yeah.
They're stuck in the wrong quarter of life. They need to move on.
But Swami Tyagananda says that moving on requires more than just knowing you should.
I somehow resist the idea that these things will come by default or naturally as we age. Because I've seen plenty of people in my life who are the retirement stage, even post-retirement stage, nowhere near this kind of a detachment or letting go in them. They were extremely cranky, extremely cynical.
So how do we do it? How do we take a break from our overstuffed, success-obsessed, fast-paced lives?
Number one is knowledge. The most important thing, this is the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself, what in my field we often call metacognition. What the Buddhists call observing oneself. Ancient Buddhist teaching has always said that when you're feeling something, either a positive or negative emotion, contemplate it at some remove as if it were occurring to another person. Now, what you're doing neurophysiologically is that a feeling, a basic emotion or tendency or urge or appetite is occurring, and it's stimulating the limbic system of your brain. When you make it metacognitive, when you contemplate it, when you meditate on it, when you just think about it, and especially if you do something like journaling it, you're going to move it to the prefrontal cortex, to the executive center of your brain. And in so doing, your feelings don't manage you. You have a fighting chance at managing your feelings, managing your urges, managing your appetite. So this ancient teaching of the Buddhists, or when you say to your little kids, use your words, you're saying be metacognitive. This is the number one, far and away, the most important idea and technique from the science of happiness that any of us can do.
Meditation is definitely a tool that helps. In fact, it's one of 3 that Swami Tyagananda recommends to help make your retirement years more fulfilling.
Meditation, prayer, and service, helping the needy. And these rituals are not simply just some mumbo jumbo. That's how we generally think about rituals. But these rituals include, in a Hindu households, every traditional Hindu family was expected to set a plate for an unexpected guest. So feeding the hungry, giving food to the needy, all those are a part of the family responsibilities.
The happiest older people, they're all about moving on with their lives. There is the whole idea of following a serious spiritual path. There's no substitute for that. We must do it. Now, I'm not talking about any particular tradition, but you have to take it seriously. There is cultivating a root system underneath us to go from deal friends to what I call real friends, which is critically important to break a success addiction, to contemplate the demise of your worldly success, to embrace your weakness. And finally, it's to get comfortable with the whole concept of change and continuous change for the rest of your life.
Including the final, ultimate change, the one from this world, this body, to whatever comes next.
Well, one thing is helpful to keep in mind, that when we come into this world, we come with nothing. We just come with this body and mind. When we leave this world, we leave with nothing, just the body and mind. So it's only in between this birth and death that we acquire this sense of possession, belonging. This is mine. I'm entitled to this. But whether we like it or not, we're just going to give away everything anyway. So what I have found personally helpful is cultivating a very positive, healthy attitude toward death. The second thing I have found helpful is to begin every day reminding myself that this could be the last day of my life. Now, if I would like to imagine, said, how would I want the last day of my life to be? If I were given a choice, what kind of a last day I would like to have? And I would think that most of us would say, I want the last day of my life to be peaceful. I don't want to fight with anybody. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be nasty to anybody. I just want all the people I love around me. Then really the way I look at myself, the way I look at the people around me, the way I look at the whatever I'm doing will change a lot if I take that thought seriously.
We talked a bit last season about how contemplating death can reorient our values. But according to Arthur, most people aren't literally afraid of death. For the strivers of the world, the bigger fear may be becoming professionally irrelevant.
One of the things that I argue is that we all have our own fear of death. People who are worried about people forgetting them, their relatives and their loved ones forgetting them. That's their death fear. We all have something having to do with the end of this mortal coil, the end of this existence, the end of the consciousness of who we are that just freaks us out. And so you have to actually do the serious work of looking right at the source of your fear. You'll finally be alive. I teach a class at the Harvard Business School called Leadership and Happiness. And one of the things that I do is I ask them to confront all fears, especially fears of change, by doing the equivalent of what the Theravada Buddhists in Southern Asia, they call the Maranasati meditation, which is the death meditation. It's a 9-part death meditation where you imagine yourself in various states of decay to make it familiar. So what I ask them to do is to take any fear that they have, especially a fear of change in their life, then you meditate on each stage, thus accustoming yourself to the inevitable. And in so doing, it becomes ordinary and it's no longer scary.
Accepting change, knowing you have limited time, and working on your spiritual growth shouldn't be a lonely process, though. Remember, in Vanaprastha, you're turning away from worldly goals and pursuits, but you're also sharing the wisdom you've learned along the way. So while you're spiritually turning inward, you're also socially turning outward, toward connection and service. It's a realization that hit Arthur on a trip to the Rockies.
I was in Aspen, Colorado, and I was writing about this idea of the lone, solitary, strong individual. And I was contemplating the first psalm. You know, a righteous man is like a tree planted by streams of water. And the whole analogy is that a righteous man is self-standing, requires the stream of water, but is a majestic lone tree. And I was using that analogy, and somebody I know who knows a lot more about botany than I do said, that's a bad analogy. And I said, how come? I said, you know that an aspen grove is actually one plant. I said, what are you talking about? It turns out that every aspen grove that you see, which is basically all the aspen trees in Aspen, Colorado, are one organism with one single root system. And each tree is not a single organism. It's the illusion of a single organism insofar as that it's a shoot coming out of the same root system. There is an ancient Buddhist concept of the illusion of autonomy, the illusion of individuality, our true cosmic inability to separate ourselves from one another. In so doing, we kill ourselves by trying to cut ourselves off from the nature of our own existence, which is an intermingled existence. I think that the Aspen Grove is a good way of thinking about this. If you don't think about the love in your life, if you don't think about the root system that is the relationships, you're not going to be healthy, and you're going to have an illusion of your own autonomy, your own individuality, which is not realistic and not satisfying as a result.
Community and connection, that all makes good sense. But focusing on them doesn't always come naturally. The thing is, we didn't evolve to be happy. Mother Nature doesn't really care about that. We're wired to propagate. The happiness part, that's up to us. And that's where spiritual practice can help.
And so we need to take our happiness into our own hands. And one of the ways that we do that is by understanding that we need to zoom out from our day-to-day existence. So if you don't think about the spiritual path and the greater cosmos, the adventure that is something bigger than us and the why of the universe, it's going to be me, my job, my car, my friends, my money. It's just so boring. I mean, in Christian prayer, we say, Lord, give me peace. Well, the spiritual path, literally, for the first time in your life, can give you peace because it gives you relief from you. I know people all the time who say, I think I'll be happy if I move to California. Well, people who say that are making a key error. You're trying to move away from something, but you can never move away from you. The only way you can get relief from you is by zooming out from you. And the spiritual path is the only way I know to do that. And by the way, the data shows that you can actually embrace completely secular philosophical traditions, go very deep, and get many of the same cognitive, psychological, and emotional benefits from it. I mean, I know people who study the Stoic philosophers and get every bit as much of the measured, self-evaluated life satisfaction that I get from my Roman Catholic faith.
That's right. It makes it happen. And so when I look back at like Hinduism, there are those 4 stages. And just by having and marking those stages, maybe you don't make it to Vanaprastha and you should, but you should. And at least there's a nudge to push you along. And so I'm wondering, in other faiths, are there similar elements that kind of help us make that change in midlife that you're aware of?
It's a good question, and I don't know about all other faiths, to be sure. There is a strong push in the Roman Catholic faith for people to deepen their religion as they get older. There's an expectation that people actually will, and there's an expectation people will spend more time on it. For example, one of the things that the Roman Catholic Church encourages people to do is to start attending daily mass when their kids move out. Now, what's that all about? That's Vanaprastha, man. That's really what that is. And I did that. When my kids moved out, I started going to mass every day. And it wasn't because I was consciously trying to do Vanaprastha, but I was encouraged to do so by a spiritual teacher. And it was a game changer because I start every morning in prayer. I started every morning in worship, confronting the metaphysical realities that are the true realities in my life.
And do you feel happy, or do you feel more fulfilled? Like, how has it changed what you do in life?
My life is richer because I'm thinking about the things that actually matter more. I have more of a grounding, more of a sense of what's actually important. And so I'm starting and ending the day, living my spiritual life, which, as far as I'm concerned, weirdly, as I get older, I'm realizing that's my real life. The rest is, and this is one of the things that the Hindus talk about in the Vanaprastha. You realize that you're authentically spiritual and temporarily physical. And so you're going to your true self. And this is how I feel. I feel more and more like a spiritual being that's existing temporarily in a physical plane. And I don't think I could have had that earlier, but it also has a lot to do with my daily practice.
So it's the doing of spirituality, not just the believing, that helps our minds make the changes we need to find happiness as we age. But it's important to remember that the whole system works better when you build a practice. As Swami Tyagananda says, it's only when you follow the path from the start, like the one laid out by the ashramas, that true happiness, purification, and clear insight can be reached.
I sometimes think it's not very helpful to look at any of these stages in isolation. It's very difficult to suddenly become spiritual. Most of us have this kind of a gradual conversion because what I do and how I live in my student stage, and what I do and how I live in my family stage, there has to be some connection to that. It can't be like, okay, that chapter of my life is closed, this is now a different chapter. So life has to have a continuity. And therefore, what I do in the retirement stage will be strongly influenced by what I have done in my family stage and what I have done in my student stage. In the Hindu tradition, they say, if you want to meditate well in the evening, you should start preparing for it in the morning. If you want to meditate well in the morning, you should start preparing for it the previous evening.
It's not that you can't learn to become more spiritual at 50, but whatever you choose to do is likely to work a lot better if it grows out of what you've done in your life until that point. We can probably all think of people who haven't been able to transition smoothly into midlife. One way of looking at the stereotypical midlife crisis is as a person who's not following the path, who's trying to do a U-turn rather than follow a natural progression. One guy who did a great job of following the right path?
Johann Sebastian Bach.
That's right. The father of Western classical music was also a shining example of midlife transitional success.
Turns out Bach's life is instructive. We should all be like Bach.
Now, if this feels a little out of left field, you should know that Arthur is a bit of a Bach fanboy. As a scientist, but also as a musician.
Early on in my career, I made my living as a classical musician. It was the whole first 12 years full-time of my career. I didn't actually go to college or become an academic until I was in my 30s. Now, Bach was the greatest, most innovative composer of the High Baroque. He comes from an ancient line of musicians, famous musicians. The Bach family goes back hundreds of years in central Germany. But Johann Sebastian Bach was the greatest of them all. He was this innovative composer. I mean, the commissions came rolling in from princes. He was making money. He was as famous as you could get in those times.
Bach was prolific. He wrote over 1,000 pieces that shaped the entire Western classical music canon. But Arthur says Bach was notable for something else too, knowing when to stop.
And then something happened, which happens to everybody, which is to say that he came crashing down his fluid intelligence curve, and his fate met reality. The music taste moved on, and he couldn't change. He wasn't capable of innovating along with what was happening. It was like he was writing the equivalent today of disco. What happened then at age 50, when he hit the wall, he decided to change his career around completely and dedicated himself to his teaching. He started writing etudes for his children. He had 20 kids, Dave.
Okay.
And yeah. He also, 10 lived to adulthood. And he was surrounded by his children who loved him and his grandchildren and his students who adored him. And he became the cantor at the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, where he would write music for the Sundays and he would teach the choir. And he dedicated himself to actually writing a textbook called Die Kunst der Fuge, The Art of Fugue, because basically said somebody's going to want to know about this at some point. Now, today, it is played in concerts. Imagine a textbook so beautiful that people read it as literature. It was 100 years after he died that Felix Mendelssohn rediscovered Bach, and he became the rock star that he is today. But he went to his grave happy. The reason is because he jumped from his fluid intelligence curve as a musical innovator to his crystallized intelligence curve as the master teacher. And near the end of his life, he was asked, why do you write music? And his answer, the aim and final end of all music is nothing less than the glorification of God and the refreshment of the soul. And he died at 65 years old, a happy man. And a satisfied man, and a man who was a man in full. A man, as St. Irenaeus would say, the glory of God, a man fully alive. That is how to do it.
The old verse goes, to everything there is a season. To that I'd add, and each can be beautiful, if we're prepared for it. Autumn can be spectacular if we appreciate and focus on the brilliance of the changing colors of the leaves, rather than regarding it as the end of warmth and summer. The same goes for midlife. It can be beautiful and rewarding if we change our expectations, if we step off the competitive treadmill and focus on sharing the wisdom we've gained along the way. No doubt that making this change is difficult, but here's where turning toward a spiritual path, or at least adopting some of its teachings, can help. It's practices like meditation, contemplating change and death, and engaging in service for others that can help our minds find new ways to find meaning as our skin begins to wrinkle and our hair turns gray. And if we're willing to make these changes in midlife, rather than try to cling to our youth, we might just avoid that happiness dip at 50. We might find more joy than regret, more contentment with the person we're becoming than the one we're leaving behind. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Josie Holtzman and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at howgodworkspod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.